Greetings, Chris Hyslop here from the Montana World Affairs Council. This is our new show, GPS, Global Perspectives on Security. In this show, we're going to try to get a little bit further past the headlines, past the facts, into some of the analysis and into some of the critical questions about what's going on in the world. And we're very fortunate to have our good friend, colleague, and partner, Mick Mulroy, a co-director from the Lobo Institute with us. Mick is also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, a retired CIA paramilitary operations officer, and U.S. Marine. He's co-founder of the Lobo Institute and board member at the Plato Institute in Athens, Greece. Mick, how are you?
Great, Chris. Great to be with you. Welcome from Whitefish.
Yeah, Mick's out here in Whitefish, a fellow Montanan. And at the Lobo Institute, they do all kinds of great things. You can see their website here on my screen. Please check them out if you're interested in more of their security analysis and training and so on. Now, Mick, what you and I are going to try to do in this show is, as I said, get past the headlines a little bit and try to understand a little bit better the geopolitical dynamics happening behind the New York Times and Fox News and Al Jazeera and what have you not. So today we wanted to look at a couple things because there's a lot going on. First and foremost is the Ukraine. Now, interestingly, just by way of preamble, when we're talking about the Ukraine, we're hardly talking about the Ukraine. We're talking about Russia and NATO and the United States. But, just quick background, 100,000 Russian troops amassed on the border, a long history of difficult relations, even prior to the 2016 annexation of the Crimea. So there's a lot of concern now about a potential military operation in the Ukraine by the Russian military. That's what we know in the news. But Mick, what I'm asking you to give us your insight on is a little bit of the calculation behind this. Why and what in the world would the Russians be thinking when they amass troops in Europe in this day and age and even consider a kind of conventional military operation on NATO's doorstep?
Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. So the two lines of thought are, President Putin, who views the collapse of the Soviet Union as the worst thing that happened in the history of his time on Earth. So it's been a sore spot with him since then. And obviously, the Ukraine is one of those former satellite states of the Soviet Union. So the calculation is this: is Putin trying to simply raise his profile back to the level of the United States, so he has multiple meetings with the U.S. president and he gets the world's attention, or does he actually intend to invade the Ukraine? I think the idea behind what this is has been shifted now toward it is likely he is going to invade again. To your point of your question, he's done this before in Crimea, but he's going to invade Ukraine again. So what is his calculation? He would like to basically own the buffer between Russia and NATO. Of course, there's NATO countries adjacent to the Ukraine. So much easier said than done. As you said, he's amassed over 100,000 troops on the border. He's also put troops into Belarus, and he is now increasing both. In conducting military exercises. So I think the odds are that he is going to mount an invasion. If he does not, he's going to look very weak, and he definitely doesn't like to do that in the eyes of the world. So what are we doing about it? We being the West, we being NATO and the United States. So we've made it clear, although we started with a rather mixed message, but we now are clear that any invasion of the Ukraine by Russia will be met with severe and swift economic sanctions. That is something that we don't normally do because we usually leave what they call strategic ambiguity. But with Russia, I think that was the best way to go about it, being very direct and letting them know exactly the consequences they face if they do this.
Well, Mick, can I jump in there?
Can I
just jump? Yeah. I mean, just on economics, I mean, anybody who watches conflict like this says follow the money. So what on the finances and these sanctions and the financial considerations, what's going on there?
So not an economic expert, but it is part of the whole national security picture that we're seeing over there. So we have the ability to put sanctions, just like we have on Iran and North Korea and many other places, and so does the UN, that can cause them significant economic disruption, specifically targeted toward the leadership. In fact, today, there was many statements from the White House even saying we're going to start at the top because the international community, monetary community, runs on the dollar. So it gives us a lot of leverage in that regard. So I think that is likely to happen immediately after any invasion, however slight, into the Ukraine. Now, the issue that a lot of experts are looking at is what is the Russians going to do in response? Well, right now the Russians produce about 40% of the energy that Europe uses. So they have a lot of leverage, and they're probably somewhat hesitant to get in a situation where Putin is allowed to use energy as a weapon, essentially. So it was reported today that the United States has been talking to Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, North Africa, and Asia even, talking about whether to increase the energy flow, oil, et cetera, into Europe to try to balance that. But this has a potential to cause significant economic disruption. So, the so what part of your question is that has an effect on the world economy. We're completely intertwined now. So this is something that we have to take in. I think we're doing the right thing. I think we should be imposing economic hardship on the Russians for invading a country, a sovereign country, again. But it's not like Putin has nothing that he can do in response to that.
Right. Now, NATO is in the middle of this thing, so let's drag them into this discussion here a little bit. We all know North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed after the Cold War, and has over the more recent decades kind of reformulated itself, retasked itself into a different organization, but still staying steadfast as a unitary treaty organization. Now, just by quick way of historical lessons is that, since imperial times in Russia, there has been a constant push out for these buffer areas in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. So this isn't a communist era thing. This predates that, and it's not simply Vladimir Putin looking for these buffers. It's been part of the Russian psyche for literally hundreds of years. Countering this now is the kind of quiet and somehow Russians see it as a sneaky expansion of NATO into their backyard, or their quote unquote sphere of influence, which is a term I understand we don't use any longer. Nevertheless, these two kind of thoughts of needing a buffer zone for the Russian state, and NATO and Western Europe, the military alliance, also pushing in the eastern direction. How do these two? How do you make ends meet here, Mick? Because it looks to me like that's a kind of a loggerhead situation.
Absolutely, it came up in many of my discussions today when I was talking, on this subject. Everything that the Russians, President Putin, is concerned about, he is now, perhaps ironically, created, right? So now NATO is extraordinarily relevant. I bet you that most countries that are in NATO now will somehow meet the mark of what they're supposed to do when it comes to their GDP in the national defense and their contribution to the NATO defense. And I would agree with you. NATO, I think, is the most significant and potentially most relevant military alliance in history. I think you could make that argument. But some people were wondering why it still existed. But now we know. And,
right.
And I think that so I think he may have created a situation where we significantly increase expenditure on the defense of NATO. Most NATO countries will want U.S. forces present, as we're seeing 8,500 are on alert to deploy, and that might just be the first. I think you'll see many of these countries, as you said, and I think totally correctly, these buffer countries that Russia's always been concerned about, they're now going to try to get in NATO. I mean, they're going to view themselves as the next in line, after a massive invasion of the Ukraine. So all the things that I think Russia was concerned about, they may have exasperated by these actions. Even the threat, even without doing it, I think most of the countries now have focused on this and realized that they need to do more in their own defense.
And Mick, if we could just have a quick look, I think, on one hand, of course, we, and I say collectively we, for most of us, the military personnel who are on the ground in the Ukraine and Russia, their superior officers, and most other people do not wish to engage in this conflict. That's a kind of, a last step, of course. But in the event that this does happen, back to NATO, what does this mean for this alliance? What does it mean for the nearby NATO countries?
So I do think you'll see a significant increase in military activity. So the exercises that used to be so carefully coordinated with Russia, the deployment of forces, which used to be down to a handful of soldiers, U.S. soldiers in Poland, are now going to be out the window. Because we're there. If they invade, then that is going to be something that is going to deal with our calculations when it comes to escalation. We are going to have to defend our alliance. We have Article 5 of the treaty itself requires us to defend each other. That's why we saw them all come to our defense after September 11, 2001. We are going to increase our deployments. There's no doubt about it. And the countries there are going to ask for it. So before they were very hesitant to, poke the bear, so to speak. But when the bears come into your front door, then you're going to look for all your friends.
You got to get the bear spray then.
You got to get the bear. It's Montana, right? So you got to have your bear spray. But this is, and I totally agree with the first part of your question. Everybody should be hoping for a diplomatic resolution to this. Anybody that thinks this is some kind of theater is just dreadfully wrong. It's going to end up with a lot of innocent people because, of course, when wars start, a lot of innocent civilians get killed. It's also going to have a massive disruption on the international economy, as we already talked about. So we should all be hoping that, the Secretary of State and, the foreign minister of Russia can come to some conclusion to this that does not end in a conflict, a military conflict. Because if it happens, I think it's going to be clear that the Russians have overwhelming conventional forces, but the Ukrainians are ready to fight. And we've been working with them, we, the United States, particularly Special Operations Forces, for many years. So they are going, and we just saw, I think, reported today, 80 tons of military hardware landed today in Ukraine. So we're talking man-portable anti-armor missiles, man-portable anti-aircraft missiles. They can cause a lot of casualties, they can cause a lot of damage. And then once the Russians are there, you're going to see an insurgency that's going to rival any insurgency that I think we've seen in our lifetime.
Right. Well, Mick, of course, people are working for peace and hoping to avoid the conflict through negotiations, but planning for something else. So thanks for connecting those dots. I would just say, just to finalize this point is, again, for Montanans, as you say, there's a lot of connections, not the least of which is Montana has the largest number of men and women in the military per capita in the United States. And so again, another impact here for us in Montana. Mick, let's shift gears for a second now. We've talked about Ukraine and a looming conflict. Now we have a possible looming peace accord between the Taliban, who have arrived recently in Oslo, Norway, for talks with their American and Western European counterparts, or quote unquote diplomats. Now, we all know what's happened in Afghanistan. No need to rehash the headlines there. And we know that they are there as some initial talks. It appears as, broadly speaking, the Taliban position is to the release of the $10 billion, which the West is now holding, and for the West to talk more seriously about human rights, including women and children's rights, and any number of other political aspects to the Taliban's governing in Afghanistan. As you said to me before we started the show, we know that there are 23 million food insecure people in Afghanistan. That's half the population, with 9 million potentially facing starvation this winter. It's cold there in Afghanistan. So again, getting away from the headlines, my question is, you have these two groups in the room. And when you're in the room like that, you have to be asking for and talking about things the other can deliver. You can talk about anything, but if you can't deliver it, why are we talking? So if the US is talking about, human rights and this thing, can the Taliban deliver? And if the Taliban are saying, hey, give us our money back, can the US and its allies really deliver on that?
So those are all really good questions, Chris. And I'd start with the fact that it's not the Taliban's money, right? So the Taliban didn't earn any of it. Most of that money was international aid that had gone to the government of Afghanistan, and the government of Afghanistan was using it primarily to run their country. So we seized it when the Taliban took over. Again, you're right. We don't need to rehash it. I would have preferred we kept a residual force there, so this wouldn't have been the case. But that decision was made. So what can we do now? The Taliban does have the ability, of course, to not be draconian in their view of human rights. They gave us very little, I would say, placating our sensitivities at this right before we left. But almost immediately, everything that they claimed they would do was not the case. I mean, women were almost immediately excluded from school, any school. I mean, before they left, I think we saw more women than men in the university in Kabul. I mean, that's a great sign. Now they're not allowed to go, period. So the human rights record has gone back exactly to where it was when we took over essentially in 2001. So the Taliban can change their ways. I doubt they will, but I think the international community should demand it. We are a free nation, obviously, the United States. We should lead free nations of the world. And part of that is ensuring that human rights, especially the basic tenets of human rights, exist in any country of which, especially, we're providing a lot of the financing to. Yeah. And I'm sure that's what our European partners think too. Sure. So now the problem is, and you already laid it out, you have 23 million food insecure people. We've got 9 million people, including many women and children, on the verge of starvation. I used to be an advisor to the Special Envoy of Yemen. His name is Martin Griffith for the United Nations. Now he's in charge of humanitarian affairs and crises for the entire world for the UN. And he's talked a great deal about the crisis looming in Afghanistan, and it is horrendous. So everybody, people from Montana, people from the United States, people around the world should care about that. You should care about the basics of that. But that is the balance. So if we give the money directly to the Taliban, are we confident that it will get to the people? Are we concerned that they might just use it for their own purposes? If we don't, how do we get the needed food and medicine to the people? So it is a very difficult question. There's no easy answer, but it's going to be something that's going to have to continue, and we're going to have to push.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's quite amazing that they're even talking in the first place. Martin Griffith, your former boss, was the predecessor of my former boss, Jan Egeland at the UN, who is in the room with the Taliban. I mean, he's a well-known peace negotiator and humanitarian. And Jan famously said, if you want to get people out of hell, you have to talk to the devil. And so he had no problem talking to people like the Taliban because he saw the bigger issue. The Europeans were very quick to say this is not some legitimization or recognition of the Taliban diplomatically, interestingly enough. Yet they are talking, and they have an agenda. They're trying to work through it. Now, Mick, let's make a few crazy assumptions that maybe they do make some progress there and that there is some kind of engagement. How would let's just say a more peaceful Afghanistan in some way, what does that look like on the geopolitical stage?
So our number one issue, the United States issue with Afghanistan, was the counterterrorism issue, or the terrorism issue that we hope to counter. That's why we went there in the first place. That's why we spent 20 years and lost several thousand men and women and spent billions of dollars. So we don't have a lot of insight into what's going on now. So from a counterterrorism perspective, if you don't have the ability to collect intelligence, it doesn't matter how good of a military force you have. They don't know where to go and what to do because they don't know what's going on. So I think we're going to look for some significant transparency, or I think we're going to look for the Taliban to make sure that ISIS-K, that's the primary Al-Qaeda affiliate, ISIS Khorasan, that's in Afghanistan, is not plotting attacks against the United States or the Al-Qaeda group that's there, right? So that's going to be the number one, because that's our primary objective when it comes to Afghanistan. And the number two, which should be one of the U.S.'s objectives everywhere, is to promote individual rights and human rights around the world. And again, this is the very basic. With females with the right to go to school, females with the right to work, females with the right to be in society without having to be with a guardian, so to speak. Even adult women have to be with a male relative. That, I think, is on us to promote. I mean, we have a certain amount of money that we spend on international aid a year. There's a lot of needy countries, and we need to use that, I think, to enforce this. Now, the problem is, and we've already addressed it, is if they're willing to let their people suffer just so they can continue with the despotic regime.
Right.
And that is on us to try to work around. Like, we still have to get food and medicine to the people without enhancing a regime that needs to be gone from the face of the earth, does not need to be enhanced. But that is the case in many places, like Syria is another place where we have to deal with the same issue.
Well, it's a tough one, and we're going to be watching it closely, Mick. Before we started, Mick and I knocked around a whole bunch of other ideas, but I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. It is our intention to talk every other Tuesday on the international security issues of the day with our expert, Mick Mulroy from the Lobo Institute in Whitefish, Montana. So please join us for these shows. Let me thank very quickly the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank, and Allegiance, who help us bring this and many other programs to you. Mick, thank you and all of your colleagues up at the Lobo Institute. Much appreciated for your insight. Look forward to talking to you in a couple weeks.
Great, Chris. I do too.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.